I'm going to tell you all about the hidden fuel adjuster screw on this type of carburettor. I'm going to tell you why it's there, what it does, and how it actually works. So, after watching this video, you are going to know more about this screw than the majority of people, certainly more than you ever have before. And just so you know, this video is not a quick fix, quickly explained video. I do show you how to adjust the carburettor, but I've purposefully explained at length the intricacies of this process to give you an understanding of what's going on. So this video is about educating the knowledge lovers. And lastly, I will cover some reasons why carburettors actually need adjustments at all. So get ready, because with the understanding of this little screw, you are just about to gain the knowledge to adjust and set the carburettor like you never have before. Welcome to the Repair Specialist channel, because knowledge is power. So let's get to it. So here's the carburettor. And let's clarify, we have the main large adjuster screw here, which adjusts the fuel-air ratio to richen or lean out the fuel reaching the engine at high RPM. In other words, when the throttle is fully open. But, as we know, with other small two-stroke carburettors, like the one fitted to this chainsaw, we also need to be able to adjust the fuel-air ratio to richen or lean out the fuel reaching the engine at low RPM. But looking at this carburettor, how do we do that? We don't have two screws here like the chainsaw does. So, with this in mind, enter the tiny hidden screw here at the top. This is indeed the adjuster screw that adjusts the air-fuel mix at low or idling speed, and otherwise known as the L screw or low screw. So clearly this screw is not as accessible as the H screw or the high screw, which I'm sure the manufacturer did for a very good reason. This was most probably to prevent the overusage of this screw that would result in the detriment of the carb settings. Some of these screws have a cap covering them, and I'm told that some are actually covered in a resin to prevent any adjustments, outside of a dealership maybe, that is. So with this in mind, maybe the manufacturer intended on you taking your machine to a repair shop each time the carburettor needs resetting. I can't say this for definite, but it does seem to be the case. But because these screws are indeed hidden away, it may well be because they don't need adjusting anywhere near as much as the H screw does. But if you do feel that you need to adjust these, and you want to save time and money by adjusting it yourself, or you are just interested in how this screw works and gathering a better understanding of it, or both, then I will not only show you how to do this, I will also show how this screw alters the air-to-fuel mix and the effects that has on the engine, to provide you with a better understanding of this system, so that when you adjust these screws, it's clear to you what you are actually doing to the engine and why. Okay then, so as we've established, this is the low screw. And if we really need to adjust this carburettor, then we will start with this screw. So I have this type of carburettor on my Weed Eater, and so we'll go ahead and start the engine and make the adjustments. We can note here that from the engine idling, if we turn the screw out anti-clockwise, then the engine will eventually sound like this. It becomes lumpy and struggles to idle. And from here, if we screw the screw inwards clockwise, then you'll see that the engine revs will start to increase, and increase more the more we turn it. So what just happened there? What did this do? Well, with these carburettors, there is a needle that protrudes into the main jet. And it's the low screw that we've been adjusting at the top that is directly connected to this needle. And so when the needle screw is fitted in its correct place within the carburettor, it's sheathed within the protruding plastic part of the main jet. And if we could see the side of this main jet from this angle, we'd see a structure there that's significant to the way this main jet works. I've actually removed this part of the main jet so we can have a closer look. And when we do, what we see on the side of it, the very thing I was talking about, is this cutout structure here, in the shape of an elongated triangle. So within the carburettor, when the needle screw is fitted in place in here, in a controlled manner, The needle can move up and down, thus opening and closing this gap. So how does this allow the carburettor to function and the engine to run? Well, during the carburettor's normal functioning, fuel is of course brought up the main jet. But at the moment, the needle is low and closing off the gap. But if the needle was to raise slightly, opening up some of that gap, then it would let some of that fuel out into the venturi of the carburettor and to the engine. And because of the very nature of this gap, from bottom to top, it gets wider. As the needle raises, we're naturally going to get an increasing volume of fuel out from the gap. And of course, as we lower the needle, we're going to start to restrict some of that fuel, so there's less available for the engine. So if the needle raises and lowers to govern the amount of fuel coming out of the main jet, then what exactly is operating the needle? As we've already seen, the needle will protrude into the main jet at such a level to allow just enough fuel out to hopefully regulate a decent idling speed. And just so we know, the way we raise the engine revs is to pull the throttle, which pulls the throttle cable, which rotates this throttle lever, and as the lever rotates, the whole throttle barrel mechanism raises, and the needle raises with it. And that exposes more of the gap in the main jet to allow more fuel out, to allow for higher engine revs. So let's now get back to gathering an understanding of the low screw adjustments themselves. Because we're talking about the needle screw being the low screw that adjusts the air-to-fuel ratio at low speed, we'll start the explanation with the engine idling. Okay, so in order to explain that, what we must make clear is that this needle is directly connected to the screw on the tip. And so of course when it's all fitted in place, this screw is turned to fit the needle into its correct position. So if we screw the screw in clockwise, the needle will lower, and if we screw it out anti-clockwise, the needle will raise. So when the engine is idling, screwing the screw out anti-clockwise will lift the needle and allow a little more fuel out. This will be adding more fuel to the air going into the engine and so richen up the mixture. And of course, if we were to screw this screw in clockwise, it would lower the needle, restricting some of that fuel going into the engine, and so the fuel-to-air mixture would be leaner. So if we've got a situation where the engine is idling like this, that's obviously not running at its best, because this sound is a symptom that the engine is running too lean. So screwing the screw anti-clockwise outwards raises the needle out of the main jet slightly. This allows more fuel out of the main jet, thus richening up the fuel-to-air mix at low revs. And so of course we adjust this screw slowly while we're listening to the engine, where the engine sounds like it's running much better. On the other hand, if the engine is idling like this, then this is a symptom of too much fuel reaching the engine at low revs. And so in this case we take the opposite stance. We screw the screw in slowly, lowering the needle into the jet, restricting some of that excess fuel coming out of the main jet, thus leaning out the fuel slightly so that the engine is receiving the right amount of fuel and therefore runs much better. Now, it's important to remember that we must not get this screw, which is the low speed screw, mixed up with the idling screw. This doesn't set the pace of the idling speed. This screw, the low screw, sets the air-to-fuel ratio mix going into the engine. The idling screw here operates the throttle. So when we feel that we've adjusted this low screw to a point where the engine seems to be running well, we can then put a further tweak onto the adjustments with the idling screw, either to speed up the low RPM slightly if it needs that, or to slow it down slightly if it needs that. Either way, we need to bring the idling RPM to a reasonable level. So this is the idling adjustment screw, and as you can see, it screws into this plastic part and it protrudes out through this and touches the throttle lever. And when the screw is screwed in, it pushes the lever across. And as that happens, it opens the throttle barrel beneath. It starts to show a gap, allowing air in through the induction tube to the engine. This increases the idling speed. And so in the opposite, when we screw this screw out anti-clockwise, the lever comes back this way and it starts to close that hole there, allowing less air through into the induction tube, and the engine revs lower. On this Weed Eater strimmer, I need to bring the idling RPM to a point where the head of the strimmer is no longer turning, but not too low that it's going to stall. So I get that nice sweet spot after adjusting the low screw. So that's the hidden L screw explained, and that's the low RPM adjusted. So now we've adjusted the low screw, we'll go ahead and adjust the single adjuster screw for the high RPM. And the adjustments on these are simple enough, so let's have a look. The H screw doesn't protrude into the main jet from the top like the L screw does, of course. It's actually set lower down deep inside the carburettor. And the tip of the H screw protrudes into a fuel hole from within the carburettor where the fuel passes the end on its way out of the main jet into the induction tube before it reaches the engine. So with the engine running on maximum, I'll take a flat screwdriver to the single adjuster screw, and if I unscrew it anti-clockwise slowly, you'll hear the engine starting to change its tone. Screwing the screw out like this is delivering more fuel down into the main jet for the engine to use, and therefore there's a richer supply of fuel for the engine. More fuel than it can comfortably combust, and so it makes this sound, and the engine revs start to lower slightly. And if I carried on unscrewing this, the engine would most likely stop due to flooding too much fuel into the cylinder. And so if I start to screw it in again, we can see the engine revs start to raise again. And that's because it's reducing that large amount of fuel going into the cylinder, and the engine can combust this amount much better, and the engine does sound better. But if I keep turning it in the same direction, it's going to shut off too much of the fuel, and there won't be enough for efficient combustion, and so the engine revs will lower once again, and it will weaken the power of the engine. So what we're looking for is to screw the screw back and get that nice sweet spot between the two, just on the edge of being rich slightly. And that's because if it's just slightly on the edge of rich, not too much, just slightly, then we've got a good amount of fuel going in there with its accompanying oil to keep everything nice and lubricated. So why do we actually need adjustment screws on carburettors? Well, let's take air density for example. Let's say we adjusted a two-stroke carburettor in the winter. In the winter, the air is going to be more dense. So if we're going to meet the correct ratio of air to fuel, we'll need a greater amount of fuel to come out of the main jet because we've got more air molecules going into the engine. So a greater volume of air means a greater amount of fuel is required to get that air to fuel mix just right for the engine to run at its best. So we've screwed out the adjustment screws to allow quite a lot of fuel out to meet the dense air requirements, and now it comes to summer. But in summer where the air is warmer, warmer air is less dense. So there's less air molecules coming through the induction tube of the carburettor and into the engine. But because we adjusted those screws outwards to allow a lot of fuel out when the air was much denser, now we could have a situation where we've got too much fuel coming out to air ratio. Therefore it's supplying the engine with too much fuel and the engine will be running too rich. So in this case, we will need to screw in the screw clockwise slightly to restrict some of that fuel to meet the air requirements coming into the engine for that particular time of year with that air density. And of course it's vice versa. If we set this carburettor in the summertime with air that's less dense, then in the wintertime when the air is more dense, there may be too little amount of fuel for the greater amount of air entering the engine. So we might have to screw this screw out to allow more fuel up for that time of year. And it's pretty much the same with altitude. If we set our carburettor up here at sea level, then there'll be a certain amount of air density here at sea level that we can set the carburettor up for. But if we go to higher altitude, let's say we climb to the top of a big hill or a mountain, of course, the higher up we go, the less dense the air. So again, there's less air molecules coming into the engine. So we have to adjust the amount of fuel to suit the amount of air coming into the engine at that altitude. So if we set the carburettor up at the top of this mountain with less air density, so we have to lean up the fuel slightly to stop it getting too rich, and then we bring it down to sea level, it may be the case that because of the increased volume of air now, because we've got a greater density at sea level, that the engine could be running too lean. So we'd have to screw the screws out anti-clockwise to allow more fuel pass to meet the air requirements to get that air to fuel mix ratio just so for the engine to run at its best. Another reason is the quality of fuel itself. If it's great quality fuel and it's new and it's highly combustible, then we only need a certain amount of fuel to come out of the main jet for the engine to run well. But if the fuel is of a substandard or it's going stale, then smaller amounts of this less combustible, less quality fuel coming out of the main jet to the engine won't allow the engine to run too well. So we might find ourselves screwing the screws outwards anti-clockwise to allow a little more fuel up to help the combustion process and help the engine to run the best it can under those conditions. But of course it probably won't run brilliantly anyway, no matter what we do, if the fuel quality is poor. Another common reason for needing to adjust the carb adjustment screws is the air filter. So the air filter is designed to let through a good supply of air through to the engine, but to filter out the impurities. So let's say we've got a new air filter on a machine. It's going to let through a maximum amount of air that it can do, and so we need to make sure that that fuel adjuster screw is screwed out to allow enough fuel to come out to meet that maximum air requirement, to again make the ratio of air to fuel at its best to make the engine run at its best. So we've now adjusted the screws outwards to allow a sufficient amount of fuel into this maximum airflow. But when this air filter over time starts to clog up, there's less airflow coming through the induction tube of the carburettor. But the screw is still set to allow a greater amount of fuel through. So now we've got a situation where there's too much fuel to air ratio and the engine may well run too rich. So in this situation, we would screw in the screw slowly, reducing the amount of fuel coming out of the main jet to make the ratio of air and fuel much better for the engine again. Of course, if the filter is too blocked, then it needs to be changed. What I'm trying to say here is that we can make adjustments to the carburettor when the air filter starts to accumulate debris and try to get the engine running as best as we can under those conditions. And so now let's look at the other side of the coin. If we've adjusted the carburettor to allow a certain amount of fuel through whilst the air filter was partially blocked, so there'd be a certain amount of air restriction coming through the carburettor, meaning that we would have to screw in the fuel screw slightly to lean out the fuel so there isn't too much fuel to air ratio, and then we put on a new air filter. We've got to remember that this carburettor has been set for more of a partial amount of air through to the engine, and now it's got a maximum flow of air, there will be too much air to fuel ratio, and so the engine may run lean. And so what we need to do now is unscrew the adjustment screw slowly outwards until the engine starts to sound a little better. Another reason we need adjustment screws on carburettors is the fuel filter. Of course, the fuel filter is there to filter any impurities out of the fuel. But over time, as that fuel filter starts to collect debris, thus not allowing the maximum flow through, then for a time, at least in the early stages of this, we can use the carburettor settings to compensate. So if we've set the adjustment screws to compensate for having a restricted flow of fuel through the fuel filter to get the engine running as best as it possibly can under those circumstances, and then at some stage we have a new fuel filter fitted where there's now a maximum flow of fuel coming through to the carburettor, then because we adjusted that fuel screw, turning it outwards to try and get more fuel up into the carburettor when the filter was blocked, then it may well now be far too open, allowing too much fuel in because we have a better flow of fuel. So it could mean that the engine is running rich, so we just need to screw the screw back in slowly whilst listening to the engine until the engine runs better. Another quite common reason we might need to adjust the carburetors is in the early stages of engine wear. Because in the early stages before the engine wear gets too bad, we can actually make adjustments to the carburetor to help the engine run as well as we can under those circumstances. So for example, let's say there's wear to the crankshaft's main bearings. These bearings make sure that the crankshaft is running completely straight as it turns. And if these bearings are worn, then the crankshaft starts to move up and down as it turns, pushing into the main seals. And so as it pushes into the seals, it creates a pressure on them and wears them out. Because a two-stroke engine relies on crankcase compression for its function, when these seals get worn out, as the piston lowers, that pressure escapes out through the seals, and as the piston rises, extra air enters the crankcase in this unnatural place due to the suction pressure behind the piston caused by its rising, and leans out the air to fuel mix. So now we've got a situation where there's too much air to fuel ratio, and so the engine will not run at its best. So when this gets too bad, there's nothing we can do with the engine. It needs to be stripped down and new parts fitted. However, in the early stages of this happening, we can make adjustments to the carburetor to counteract this effect. In fact, in the early stages, this effect is so subtle that often we don't actually know that it's the main seals causing the problem. We just set about adjusting the carburetor, and the way we do that is we turn the screws outwards like we do before, richening up the amount of fuel coming out of the carburetor to make it so we've got a better fuel to air ratio mix. And again, for a time, this rectifies the problem as much as it can possibly be rectified. Another problem that can occur that can cause these same type of symptoms is when the inlet boot is split, allowing air into the system here in this unnatural place. Also, if the carburetor is slightly loose, allowing air in here on the opposite side of the carburetor before it's pulled the air in past the main jet, that can also cause this kind of problem. But what I want to know is, what do you think? Do you know any other reasons why carburetors need adjusting? And, more importantly, do you know of a better way to adjust these types of carburetor? Because I'm not saying my way is the best. The community that reads these comments learns such a lot from everybody's point of view and everybody's knowledge who actually make comments here on this channel. And so I really respect all your comments. And because you've watched this video of details about this type of carburetor, then this video showing you how it works in depth from the primer system to the main adjuster screw will really capture your interest. So have a click through now and check that out next. But as always, it's been a pleasure explaining this. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.